Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the most, just absolutely dramatic transformations in all of European history. We're talking about the rise and the spectacular fall of absolute power in France. It's a story that really revolves around one guy, a figure who literally defined what it meant to be a king, Louis XIV. We're going to see exactly how France clawed its way out of total chaos to become this glittering, supreme state, and then the incredible, devastating price they paid for all that power. Let's get right into it. So, here's the big question we need to unpack. How in the world did a nation, one that was completely ripped apart by violent religious wars, managed to turn itself into Europe's most dazzling absolute monarchy? And then, why risk throwing the whole shebang away? As we go through this, I want you to think about absolute power, almost like the main character of our story today, because we are tracking some wild, extreme pendulum swings in French history. Which brings us to Section 1, Out of the Ashes. Okay, to understand the height of French power, we actually have to start at rock bottom. Between 1562 and 1598, France was an absolute mess. Torn apart by eight insanely violent religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. The national trauma was just immense. But then, in 1589, enter Henry of Navarre, the first Bourbon king. Now, Henry was a Protestant prince, stepping in to rule a deeply majority Catholic nation. So what does he do? He gets incredibly pragmatic. In 1593, he actually converts to Catholicism. He figured, it was the best way to placate the masses and finally stop the bleeding in his country. But he didn't just turn his back on his former allies. In 1598, Henry pulled off a massive political win with the Edict of Nantes. This was a landmark order. It finally gave the Huguenots, that's the French Protestants, the right to just live in peace in a Catholic France. It even let them set up their own churches in certain cities. And by finally hitting pause on the religious violence, Henry was able to get the economy moving again and restore some much-needed order. Even with peace, though, the psychological scars from all that fighting ran incredibly deep. Imagine watching your neighbors literally kill each other over whose absolute religious truth was right. It horrified French thinkers. And out of that trauma came a massive intellectual pivot: skepticism. People started arguing that doubting these old, rigid ideas wasn't a bad thing. It was actually the vital first step to finding the actual truth. So out of all that chaos, they were essentially laying the intellectual groundwork to totally rethink authority. Let's move on to Section 2, Building Absolute Power. So Henry IV brought the peace, right? But his successor, Louis XIII, he was notoriously weak. And look, a weak king in a fragile country that is just trying to recover, that creates a massive, really dangerous power vacuum at the very top. But Louis XIII did do one incredibly smart thing. He asked for help. That help arrived in the form of a brilliant chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Now, make no mistake about it, Louis XIII might have been the guy wearing the crown, but Cardinal Richelieu, he was the true ruler of France during this time. The guy was a mastermind. He was the strategic architect of absolutism, and he systematically stepped in to grab more and more power for the monarchy, right at the expense of everyone else. Richelieu was methodical, ruthless, really, and neutralizing any potential threats. First up, the Huguenots. He banned them from building walls around their cities. Boom! Now they can't hide behind defenses to defy the king. Next, the nobility. He literally forced them to physically destroy their own castles, totally wiping out their military strongholds. And finally, the government itself. Instead of relying on the nobles, he staffed his administration with everyday middle-class workers. Piece by piece, Richelieu just dismantled anyone who could even dream of challenging the crown. All right, Section 3, the Sun King's Grandeur. Fast forward to 1643. Louis XIV inherits the throne, and he's only 5 years old. A guy named Cardinal Mazarin ruled for him at first, but Louis's childhood was an absolute nightmare. It was defined by these violent, chaotic riots that directly threatened his life. So what does a childhood like that do to a young king? It forged a single burning obsession. He swore he would consolidate so much power and grab such total control that absolutely no one would ever be able to threaten him again. Taking a massive page right out of Richelieu's playbook, Louis completely shut the nobles out of his government. Instead, he gave that power to intendants. These were official government administrators. But here was the absolute genius of it: loyalty. Louis made sure these intendants answered exclusively to him. With one move, he essentially centralized all the administrative power of France right into his own hands. But hey, if you want absolute power, you're going to need absolute wealth. Louis found his economic mastermind in Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his minister of finance. Colbert was a machine. He launched this aggressive mercantilist agenda. He built up domestic French industry, aggressively pushed citizens to buy strictly local goods, and poured resources into expanding their Canadian colonies to totally monopolize the wildly lucrative fur trade. Every single policy was designed to funnel immense, unchecked cash straight to the crown. And boy, did Louis know how to spend that cash. He weaponized all that wealth into just glaring, unmatched luxury. I'm talking, of course, about the massive Palace of Versailles. Under his rule, France became Europe's undisputed superpower. They had the largest population, the biggest military, and Versailles, it wasn't just a lavish home. It was a physical, awe-inspiring manifestation of his absolute supremacy over everyone. But think about how Louis used Versailles to deal with the nobles. How did that reflect his absolute authority? Well, Versailles was incredibly beautiful, sure, but it was also a trap. He wanted absolute control, right? So he forced the nobility to literally live at his court. He made them depend completely on his personal favor, totally stripping them of their independence. He kept his potential enemies incredibly close, where he could watch their every single move. It was a brilliant, ruthless cage.
That brings us to Section 4, the cost of hubris.
Because, as you might guess, unchecked ambition is a very dangerous thing. Louis won some early regional conflicts, and he got bold. He started trying to seize even more territory. But how did all those expansionist wars backfire? Well, his aggression basically became the glue that united his enemies. By the late 1680s, rival nations were forming these massive unified alliances specifically to stop French expansion. His obsession with dominating everyone else created an opposition that was finally strong enough to block him. And the fallout wasn't just on the battlefield. It was utterly devastating at home. You take the astronomical financial cost of funding constant warfare, and you collide that with a brutal series of poor agricultural harvests, it was a complete disaster. The absolute monarch was now draining the very nation he had spent his life building up, plunging the French people into severe poverty and starvation. This whole era of hubris really culminates in the disastrous War of the Spanish Succession. This was a grueling conflict that dragged on from 1700 all the way to 1713. It sparked when France and Spain actually tried to unite their thrones. Europe was terrified of this massive Bourbon superpower, so they all banded together to stop it. And it worked. The defeat was a humiliating blow, forcing both France and Spain to surrender vast chunks of their colonies in the Americas and Europe. The aftermath of all this established a completely new world order. France and Spain were left territorially diminished and completely financially exhausted. And the clear victor in all of this? England. By forcing these massive territorial concessions, England perfectly capitalized on Louis's mistakes and emerged as the new rising global superpower. Louis's total obsession with absolute dominance had ultimately shifted the entire global balance of power right away from France. So we've really seen an incredible pendulum swing today, haven't we? From the ashes of those brutal religious wars to the careful construction of a powerful state, up to the blinding, glittering heights of Versailles, and finally crashing down into devastating wars and exhausted resources. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Louis XIV, traumatized by childhood riots, built this absolute monarchy to ensure he would never, ever be threatened again. But was the absolute security he sought really worth the absolute ruin he ultimately caused his people? It's a question that still echoes through history today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring these incredible historical turning points.